Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Mullen. I'm the acting chairman of the hearing for the comprehensive permit at 582 Blue Hill Avenue. And with me tonight are Mr. Frank O'Brien and Ms. Giselle Joffer, members of the Board of Appeals. We are here to continue the recessed hearing from the last session, at which we've discussed several issues pertaining to the application that's been submitted by Mr. Schomer's client. Welcome, everybody. Tonight, the subject of the hearing is we're going to hear a peer review report from the board's consultant that is retained to conduct a peer review on site civil, Mr. Sean Reardon. Welcome, Mr. Reardon. It's good to see you. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you as well.
Before I recognize you, I wonder if we might address Mr. Schomer, if the board's, and we could do this either at the top of the meeting or at the end, but I think it might be appropriate to do it now to address Mr. Schomer's letter that we received this afternoon regarding the peer review for the gardens. What's the pleasure of the members?
I'm happy to defer to you, Mr. Chairman, whatever is most efficient.
Ms. Joffer?
So I confess I have not read that letter, so
Okay.
I'd appreciate some time to do so.
Okay, let's delay that. I do want to address it at some point, and if you don't have a chance to read it, I think that's okay. I think we should address it though, because what's happened, Ms. Joffer, is that the applicant has objected to the board's request for peer review on the gardens, on preservation of the gardens. So it's definitely a worthy topic. But I want to move the agenda, and we could do that. Ms. Joffer, did you have a question?
Right. And no, I recall that. And so I know what it's about. I just didn't realize that the letter had come in. And so, I will take a quick look at it and be prepared to address it this evening.
Okay. Oh, we'll do that. We'll do that later.
Thank you.
Is there anything else, Mr. Schomer, you'd like to address to the board's attention at this time?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Jesse Schomer of Rignante Stereo, attorney for the applicant. Just one minor matter that we had discussed last week, Mr. Chair and members, which was the issue of the stormwater system for the project. The last we spoke about this, we had let you know that the engineers were in the process of revising that system. And I understand that our engineer, Jim Burke, is on the line, and that he and Mr. Reardon had a brief conversation today in which they spoke about the new system. And what I can report to the board now is that they're putting the final touches on the system, which would, the proposal would be to move the entirety of the drainage structures outside of the footprint of the building to be with in the rear setback of the building, just behind in the members may recall from the site walk, there was an open field area in the back behind the house, and the proposal would be to move the drainage structures into that area. The reason for the original system was to try to minimize the amount of disturbance on the site and to keep the work as much as possible away from neighbors. But based on the concerns from the board members and Mr. Chesia and the report that came in today from Mr. Reardon, the message that we're getting was pretty loud and clear that the desire was to move the drainage structures out from the building. And so that's what they proposed to do. So that plan is being finalized now, and it should be ready hopefully within the next week or so. What we would propose to do is to proceed tonight as planned with no changes. And then as we make our responses and plan changes in addressing issues that Mr. Reardon has flagged, we would also file our updated site plans with the new drainage system incorporated into that. That would be my proposal.
Okay, so a couple of thoughts. The board didn't express a desire as to what to do with the drainage system. The board just expressed a desire to have a drainage system that worked. That's the goal. So I
Absolutely.
don't want there to be any misunderstanding. The board is not directing this design. The board is asking for a drainage system that works. The drainage system that came in seemed to us to not work. So that's where we are. With respect to the peer review, I am anxious to hear from Mr. Reardon, and I did go through his letter, for which I've thanked him and appreciate his time. We are going to have this subsequent design peer reviewed, which will be more expense and time.
Understood.
So looking ahead, we have one more meeting scheduled for next Tuesday. I'm interested in the applicant's turnaround time for a revised design, for that to be subsequently peer reviewed and for us to get back to the business of the hearing. And you know that I am obsessed isn't the right word. Focused is an appropriate word on the dates that the town has given us to conduct this hearing, separate and apart from any regulatory guidelines. So that's just something to think about. So maybe next Tuesday evening, it would be helpful to hear from the applicant on the schedule of turnaround, and then we could rebuild the schedule so that we can accommodate both the peer review professionals who've given us their time and expertise and your own production schedule. So, I mean, just looking ahead, that's what I'm thinking. Fair enough?
Sounds reasonable to me.
Okay. Mr. Hill, is there anything you'd like to add before we get going?
No, thank you.
Okay. Any comments from the members?
None for me, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Joffer?
None for me, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Reardon, welcome to the Board of Appeals. I'd introduce Sean Reardon, who's with the firm of Tetra Tech. He is a professional engineer, is a vice president with Tetra Tech, and he's conducted peer review of the site civil materials that came with the application. Now, for those of you following this hearing closely, and I know many of you are, you'll recall that we had agreed that it was important to have the application as submitted peer reviewed, recognizing, as Mr. Schumer pointed out, that there are modifications. So I think it might be helpful to hear about those modifications, but we also want to give you the time, Mr. Reardon, for you to go through your the careful review that you've done. So welcome to the Board of Appeals. We look forward to hearing from you tonight.
Thanks. Would you like me to start, or do you want to start with Jim, or how do you want to?
No, we'd like you to, I think the best way to proceed is for us, you just describe what it is you did and what you looked at, what conclusions you drew, and what concerns you might have and things to point out for the board. And then I think you might want to follow that up with how those concerns potentially could be addressed by a redesign from DeSelberg. Fair enough?
Sure. So real first, what we've been tasked to do is review principally the civil engineering and environmental issues. By civil engineering, I mean water supply, wastewater supply and demand, traditional civil engineering issues like access, layout, stormwater, drainage, as well as environmental issues associated with the wetlands that are on site. The wetlands were a fairly simple issue because as currently proposed, they're staying 100 feet away from that resource area. So at least presently, we don't have too many comments to offer on that. Perhaps as the design changes, it forces them to have to go into that area a little bit more, in which case we'll look a little bit deeper at those things. We did issue a 5-page letter, 36 or so comments. Admittedly, a lot of those comments are things that, frankly, probably Jim and I are the only ones that are going to care about. But there are.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah, perhaps that wasn't diplomatic enough, but there are things like related to the model that are important, just not terribly interesting to most people, which I'll save people the anxiety associated with them. But rest assured, we'll track every one of these things and make sure that they're all addressed before this product is finished. But I think that the takeaway is pretty accurate from what Mr. Schomer described, that our fundamental concern was the stormwater system. And there's going to be a big change in how much impervious area is on the site. So there's a big burden going forward to mitigate that stormwater. And because it's in such a sort of an urban location, there's not a whole lot of site for things to get lost and for things to sort of take care of themselves. It's really a hypersensitive site because they're developing most of it. So while they're increasing the impervious area, they're also reducing the amount of area on site that they can use to mitigate that change. So it really puts a high burden on the work that Jim's doing related to stormwater. And from our perspective, the original proposal was pretty much a non-starter for a lot of reasons. Most importantly, because to your point, Chairman, the location underneath the parking garage was just really not a tenable solution for stormwater and really didn't comply with guidelines. I'm comforted after the conversation with Jim earlier today that they're on a more sort of reasonable track. It's still going to be a challenge for them to meet the standards and the footprint that they have. So I'm anxious to see what they have. But there's going to be some considerable changes that stem from that change. Also, probably the secondary issue is just in general, the access around the site. So it's great that they have a loop road that provides first responders an ability to get to all parts of the building. But what we would hope to get is something that's a little bit more detailed to show whether that access is wide enough and whether there's enough space in which the larger vehicles can turn. So it's one thing to show a roadway going around the building. It's another to make sure that the fire trucks can safely and reliably get around that road. So we've asked for a little bit more detail on that. But aside from that, I think the work product for a preliminary plan was pretty comprehensive. I think I shared most of the comments that were on record from the community's review consultant and from the town DPW. We have asked for something that the ZBA can use to form a factual decision that water and sewer are adequate to serve the site. So right now we've got a building that's 30-fold more than what would ever planned to have been on that site under current zoning. So from a wastewater perspective, the infrastructure was probably never designed to handle a facility this big. So what we want from the applicant is something that the ZBA can rely on and that we can review that substantiates the fact that there's capacity available in the collection system to serve the project safely. Same applies to water. Building's probably quite a bit taller than ever would have been proposed there. It's kind of a unique demand within the community. So we want to make sure that there's adequate water supply, that nobody in the neighborhood is going to be adversely impacted by the proposed use of the structure and the proposed use of the facility. So just really something we want from the applicant, from a qualified person that can, help the ZBA form a factual opinion on those things. Aside from that, I think the changes that we've asked are technical in nature, and I briefed Jim on most of them, and I think we're on the same path. So now we just have to wait and make sure that they get addressed properly. What I would ask is that the applicant provide a response to each of our comments, because what we'll do is we'll track the life of each of these comments. As new comments come up, we'll give them a new number. So at the end of this process, we'll have a complete list of everything and a complete tracking of its resolution through to the end. And then I did get a chance to visit the site, but I didn't feel comfortable going on the subject property. So if there's a way I could get on the site and see the wetland and the physical characteristics of the site, yeah, that'd be great as well.
Is that it, Mr. Reardon?
Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask members of the board if they've got any questions for Mr. Reardon?
I don't. Thank you.
Ms.
Mr.
Jaffe?
Chair. No questions from me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. O'Brien?
Mr. Chairman, I have a number of questions, but I'm mindful of the fact that I always seem to have a number of questions. So out of courtesy, I'd like to defer to you or Ms. Jaffe, because I always seem to be the one that is monopolizing folks' time.
I like your questions. But, if you're shy, I've never known you to be shy, Mr. O'Brien.
Well,
Shy. I will ask my questions. Mr. Reardon, do you recommend additional soil samples on the site?
Well, to the extent that this stormwater design stays the way it is, there have to be, yes. But if they do have 3 soil samples taken at the rear of the site, if all of the stormwater ends up getting treated at that location, then they don't have a need for additional testing. But my sense is, yeah, that there will need to be additional testing.
So we've got a situation where you've got a large increase in the reduction of the impervious area. I think you used the ratio of 60%.
Yeah, 60% of the site will be an impervious surface.
60% will be impervious. And then we've also got a situation where we may have some infrastructure that might not be adequately sized for a building this large. In other words, the heritage of the property or the neighborhood was developed for a different kind of building. So therefore you might have some capacity issues. That's I think where you were going with that point, right?
Yeah, more because of its urban setting. I'm not as concerned as I would be in a more rural or a suburban setting. But nonetheless, it's clear that whoever was designing the original system, I doubt would have contemplated such a dense development on this parcel. So it definitely warrants something on the record addressing those concerns.
And then we've got elevation issues that begin up at the top of Brush Hill and really end down at the brook, at a trout brook at the bottom of the hill. I'm wondering if you could give us a sense of how those challenges stack up in light of this project. Is this a small problem, a medium problem, a large problem? I realize Tetra Tech builds, multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects, but just in the scheme of what we're looking at, what kind of challenge do we have here?
Yeah, I think the issues are solvable, but the problem is fairly typical for 40B projects where the capacity of the site is pushed to its limit. What happens is, very little, if any, excess area is available. So the premium on these solutions being correct and being properly designed and work properly is really high because there's just no other available space that if mistakes get made that you can fix things later because there's just not room left on the site. And what it does, it puts just a premium on everything. So issues that sometimes are minor on more or lessly developed sites become major because there's just no opportunity to fix them after the fact. So yeah, as you get into these projects, because they're so densely developed and you're sort of raising how much you have to mitigate for while at the same time eroding the space you have to mitigate it in, it really makes sometimes what are simple challenges difficult. I think in our situation here, we're particularly sensitive to the folks that are at the end of Meeting House Lane. They're directly down gradient. They're not very far from the site. The development is going to be right at their back door. And there is no opportunity for Mother Nature or unutilized footprint to mitigate mistakes that might get made. So I think they're solvable, but the important thing is that the applicant and the applicant's engineer understand that they're not going to be easy, and frankly, we're not going to let things go. So you might as well start now doing things the right way and exactly the way they need to be done, because it's going to end up being that way.
Fair enough. Thank you. Excuse me. You said you took a look at the excuse me, the professional, the review, the report that was done by Mr. Chessier. Which, we heard from Mr. Chessier and appreciated his presentation, and we've got his letter in the file and part of the formal record. Did you incorporate in your peer review report Mr. Chessier's concerns so that the tracking that you described in terms of itemizing and numbering and keeping an eye on them would be fully incorporated in the subsequent design, or is that something that the board's going to want to pay separate attention to in terms of confirming whether or not Mr. Chessier's concerns have been addressed?
I think we share almost all the same opinions. I think there are some issues that I brought up that perhaps he didn't notice or didn't mention. I don't know if there's any, I mean, I had the benefit of having seen his letter. So I was able to, if I was going to miss it, I didn't miss it after reading it in his letter. But there might be an opportunity where our opinions diverge. So I'd say at present, the issues are very similar. And I think my comments capture most, if not all of his comments, but yeah, I'd be careful that at some point that our opinions may diverge, and I'd feel more comfortable if we kept our opinions as our opinions.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that as much as I was suggesting that he seemed to have some big concerns, that when I read your letter, it seemed like you had, the question I have is, do we need to track both big concerns, or are they the same big concerns?
They are fundamentally the same concerns.
That's what I thought. Yeah. Okay.
And what I'll do is I'll make sure that if he issues another letter, I'll make sure to include any concerns that I share with him in our letters.
Fair. Thank you. You commented on the perimeter road, and you made a comment to the effect of, it's one thing to show it, it's another thing to make sure that a fire vehicle can get around that corner. Did you state that you were going to take another look at that, or do you actually have an opinion as to whether the town's fire apparatus can make the perimeter move?
No, what I recommend is that the applicant and their engineers provide a graphic that shows how a truck would navigate that roadway. Yeah. And that would serve as the basis for in my comments, and then that would be good for the record, demonstrating to the fire department as well how it would work. I would also suggest that it include not just a fire truck. I would suggest it include a reasonable sized delivery van or something like that, because there is no other opportunity for a vehicle to get in and out of that facility if they can't navigate that roadway. So sometimes the geometry of a fire truck is quite a bit different than a small tractor trailer or a large delivery truck. We'd like them to do both, just to make sure the emergency responder needs are addressed as well as the resident needs are addressed. Yeah,
thank you. I know you didn't do a traffic analysis, but you did refer to the internal roadway infrastructure, and I don't know the extent to which you looked at that, but there's been a fair amount of testimony in this hearing, excuse me, on site circulation, the operation of, but a number of issues. One is presented by the topography of the property. The other is the location of the garage and the fact that the road has been designed as a two-way road in, that is, going down the hill, entering the garage, and then exiting the garage and going back up the hill and exiting through the same entrance, while at the same time also serving a function to go, it would be clockwise, continue clockwise around the perimeter road, and then exiting at the southerly entrance. The southerly entrance has got some issues with respect to the site view, because what happens is as you come up 138 heading northbound, there's a bit of a hill, and you don't have a whole lot of site visibility. So there are a number of issues. In addition to that, there's been an issue raised with the parking lot in the front, and whether or not that couldn't be redesigned to make it so that cars entering from the north driveway going into the parking lot could exit from the south driveway without going back into the perimeter road. The architect had suggested that on a couple of the site visits. It's a long way of asking you whether or not you've given any thought to the site circulation and recommendations on how it might be improved to accomplish the objectives of the design.
I haven't got to the point yet where I'm ready to suggest improvements, because I think there are fundamental issues with stormwater and things like that I'd have to need to see how those get solved first. But to your point, I foresee that southerly entrance, I think it's the southerly entrance, the one if you're facing the building to the right, will very little, if at all, because
will what? I'm sorry. Will be used?
Will be used very little, if at all. because anybody coming or exiting the garage from the other side of the building is certainly not going to go around the site to use that entrance to come and go. And then similarly, the parking lot out front doesn't connect to that other entrance. They'd have to circulate all around the site. That being said, I think that loop roadway provides a critical function for emergency access. So it's certainly not something I would want to forego, just because given the height of this building, the density of the site, certainly the more robust access is for the fire department, the better off the residents will be and the responders will be. So that being said, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done at 140 units or so.
118.
I'd have to defer to the traffic consultant and capacity. That's probably not too many people to process through a single intersection. The question becomes is how will it be used if there's two driveways? Will it be used the way you want it to be used, and do they have to circulate around the building when they otherwise wouldn't have to? So if you were going to use one way in and one way out, I would absolutely want to see that front parking lot connected to both, so that entering traffic wouldn't have to circulate around the whole back of the building in order to get to the other side. But we can certainly look at that as we go forward.
All right, so that's additional work, things to think about. I appreciate that. My last point is I would love it if you could get on the site, and I'm talking to you, Mr. Reardon, but I'm looking at Mr. Schomer as I say that. I think that would be great if you saw the site. I also would like to suggest that you look at the open channel that's to the north of the site through the Delphi property. Mr. and Mrs. McGrath have commented on that. We've had Mr. Howard testify, several other people, both on Robbins Road and on Meeting House Lane, speak to this. It's an open channel that heads into a covered culvert, some type of swale at the bottom of the hill and then into the brook. I think it would have value to just see how the whole thing works, because the sense that I have, I'm not an engineer, is that there's a lot of water simply just running off from several different directions. All of it, not all of it on the site, but there's some existing conditions that are challenging. And I have a sense that we're adding to that, and we're obviously trying to avoid that. I know Mr. Burke has testified to this quite a bit. So I would like to see if we could design that kind of a site visit, and perhaps ask Mr. Berkeley to attend. Maybe Mr. Zawinski could make that request, and then I'd be interested in attending myself. So that it's all a long way of saying I think it's a good idea that you see the site, and I think there's several different things that we could learn. So we can address this at another time, Mr. Schomer. But let's make a note that we want that to happen. I suspect it may be a better thing to have the site visit after the redesign is in. So we'll be more knowledgeable, particularly with respect to the interference with the 100-foot buffer. I'm interested in that. I don't have any further questions. I'll ask. I'm not going to ask Mr. O'Brien if he's got any questions. I'm concerned, but I'll ask Ms. Joffer if she has a question or two.
No, I don't. Thank you.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for asking a number of the questions that I would have asked as well. So, Mr. Reardon, thank you and welcome to the Board of Appeals. Thank you for your report. I find this stuff fascinating, but one of the things, a couple of questions to start off with. And one is, I assume that the redesign of the drainage system encompasses both the drainage system that was proposed to be within the footprint of the building, but also the drainage system that was in front of the building, because your report raises some concerns with that as well. And could you just talk to us a little bit about what kind of maintenance issues are associated with these types of systems? Is it something that needs to be looked after on a yearly basis?
Actually, there's very prescriptive requirements for how these get maintained, and they're documented as part of the operation and maintenance plan that will be submitted before the end of the project. I think a draft one has already been submitted. But to your point, particularly these underground infiltration systems, which are, for years have been out of sight, out of mind. It's very, very critical that they get maintained and maintained properly. That even extends to sort of things you can do during the design that make that easy, which we'll typically comment on later, such as incorporation of things called isolator rows, all with the intent of preventing contaminants from migrating into the system that is designed to infiltrate water into the ground. As you can imagine, the biggest problem with these systems is over time, they inevitably get clogged. So when you have to think about placing these systems, you have to think about, well, what happens if, and likely when they erode their capacity or erode their ability to mitigate the groundwater, or mitigate the stormwater, what's going to happen? So what we'll do is we'll make sure we get these designed as robustly as possible and make sure that there are prescriptive measures in the documents submitted to you that tell exactly what needs to be done to maintain these systems.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about the, if you will, the major drainage infrastructure components of this. But is it fair to say that there are other, if I could mix some metaphors here, some other drainage hotspots throughout the site, if you will? You mentioned one by the garage door. Are there others that we should be taking a look at as well, or the applicant should be taking a look at?
Not that present themselves right now. And even those ones that like the drainage at the door, it's a relatively simple remedy, but if it doesn't get done, it's a problem. So what we'll do is we'll make sure that those things get noticed and tracked so that they're resolved before we get to the end of this process. I think that the 900-pound gorilla is the placement of that larger system. That's going to have reflective changes everywhere because of its footprint is going to be fairly big. It's going to have to be offset from groundwater. It's going to have to be accessible and maintainable. So I would expect some significant changes to the way the site looks as a function of that design change. And until we see that, it's almost immaterial to point to some of the smaller issues because I expect they'll change as a function of that design change.
If that major drainage system in the rear needs to be accessible and maintainable, is it reasonable to think that it could have an impact on the design of the circulation road?
I think it's reasonable to, but the circulation road is pretty close to the building, so you're required to have the infiltration system offset from the foundation. So my guess is that the loop road will fall somewhat in that offset, but the two things at hand are does the roadway design have to change to accommodate larger vehicles like the fire truck? If not, you only have the space in which to work. You can certainly put an infiltration system underneath a roadway. That's allowed. So I'm pretty sure that there are solutions that can come up with a plan that serve both those needs.
All right, I have a couple of additional questions, but this is the last drainage question, if you will. Let's go into the sewer a little bit. You've noted a request to clarify the extent to which the sewer serves off-locus properties. Are you referring to the sewer going through the back of the building?
Exactly.
We had testimony at the last hearing of a homeowner, I believe it was at the end of Meeting House Lane, who recounted to the board some significant sewage backup issues on his property. I personally have been concerned about the presence of that and don't feel that we have had, as a board, sufficient amount of information about what's there, its capacity, or anything else. So I'm thankful that you've identified this as an issue.
Yeah, and actually, Jim and I spoke about that today. I'm a bit surprised that there would be problems on Meeting House Road Meeting House Lane, because it's so steep. I would expect the sewer line to be steep as well, which means it usually has a lot of capacity if it's steep. And if a problem would manifest itself, it would more likely manifest itself at the bottom of the hill.
It is at the bottom.
Oh, is it? Okay, then that explains things. So what you have is sewer coming down the hill with a lot of energy, and if it hits, a constrained network at the bottom, it's got energy and it's going to push its way into homeowners or into homes. So what we need to look at the hydraulics of that receiving sewer at the bottom of the hill and make sure that that's not overtaxed. And the best way to do that is to have some either metering data or some visual information that allows us to benchmark how that system performs. So we're coming up on the spring, will be ideal time to go and check the functioning of those sewers during wet weather times to sort of get a data point that we can base our opinions on.
What, if anything, should we be worried about in terms of this 10-inch corrugated metal pipe? Is this a mystery pipe?
Yeah, but mystery pipes aren't unique. There are mystery pipes, virtually on every project, and some mystery pipes that present themselves during the course of construction. I would say it could be two things. It could be an opportunity and it could be a burden. My biggest concern is that there's something that connects from Blue Hill Avenue through the site to that drain system, in which case we'd need to accommodate it through the site, which may be a challenge given the proposed project. But really it was there to serve something, and it's not just a small pipe, but 10-inch pipe is a pretty good sized drain. Like if it were a 4-inch pipe, I think could be a lot of different little things, but a 10-inch pipe usually means there was some intent there. But the best way to find out is we got to track it back up into the site and see what happens to it. If we put a video camera in there and find out that it's full of dirt 30 feet up, well, then we've got pretty good confidence that it no longer serves any intended purpose. But if it tracks all the way up to Blue Hill Avenue and we see flow in it, then we've got to do some more work to make sure that we're not interrupting anything that it serves.
Thank you. I wonder if we could turn to the construction management plan portion of your letter. And in your overview, to kind of put words in your mouth a little bit, this is a constrained site, and there's going to be a premium on space available for things such as construction material storage, dirt, everything else. And as a result, there are going to be some things that are going to need to be done, particularly on the erosion control side of things. As an amateur, how much stuff is basically going to be, can you put on the site, and how much of the stuff is going to have to be trucked off-site or stored elsewhere? Is there going to have to be some sort of off-site staging for construction materials? And if so, wouldn't that result in increased construction-related traffic and associated nuisances?
So to answer your question about the stuff, there's going to be a lot of stuff and not a lot of space to put it in. The big thing what we want is we want there to be a documented plan that shows a thoughtful process for addressing exactly those questions. So if they go to lay out a construction management plan and realize that they just have enough room for construction trailers and a few parking spots, then those other questions you brought up need to be addressed. And I can't imagine a scenario where there won't have to be some really, really hardcore logistics exercises done or an off-site staging plan has to be incorporated. Just because, for example, if you can't work within the footprint of the building, you're not supposed to work or store materials above the location of an infiltration system. If you can imagine, what you don't want to do is compact the soils underneath that system. So there are prohibitions to actually working and compacting the soils above those. So that takes up more sort of usable footprint of the site. Doesn't really leave a whole lot left once you get trucks in and out. So yeah, we'd like to see a plan that addresses those critical components and hear how they're going to do it.
So if I just heard you correctly, it's a constrained site, and with the redesigned drainage plan, moving the drainage infrastructure to someplace else on the site, that's going to reduce the amount of space available for construction-related logistics.
Correct.
Okay. Final question, and then I'll turn it back to the board, Mr. Chairman. You noted that there's no dedicated space for snow storage, and I noticed my colleague, Ms. Joffre, mentioned snow storage earlier in this proceeding, and we were talking about snow storage, melting, stuff like that. But it sounds like snow storage has a real potential to impede access to the site. And it sounds like you're recommending that a snow storage plan be included, and that some sort of off-site snow storage plan be implemented. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Yep. And then this is not unique as we deal with situations where, particularly again on these 40B projects, where everything is pushed out and the density is pushed to its limit, we lose these convenience spaces that that are there for snow storage, for other miscellaneous things that aren't typically foreseen or just need to be accommodated as you go. In this case, our particular concern is along the property with the Delphi property. There's about 5 or 6 feet between the property line and the edge of road, which means you've got a building on one side, not a whole lot of area to plow snow. What we want to do is make sure that people understand that this is a limitation on the site, so that there's a thoughtful approach to how it's going to be handled, so it doesn't end up being that it just gets pushed into a neighbor's property who happens to have space where yours doesn't. So, it's not that there's not solutions, but I think they need to be documented as being a common point of understanding between the board and the applicant as to how it's going to be handled.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Ms. Barr, is there anything you'd like to recommend to the board at this time?
Not with regard to this. No, I'm fine. I actually have been in communication with Mr. Reardon anyway throughout, so I don't have any additional things to say at this point.
Thank you. Mr. Burke, I wonder if you are interested in making a comment or reaction to what we heard from Mr. Reardon. You don't have to. You do have to turn you have to.
There we go.
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
I had the advantage of listening to the board and earlier, and having the site walk and listening to comments from the site walk. Also having John Chessia's letter, and it gave me the impetus to kind of take a look at the design again and kind of move on revising it. And I got Mr. Reardon's letter, and luckily, a lot of those concerns that he raised, I think we've addressed. There are certainly things in that letter that we have to continue to address. Construction management, and certainly one of them, and it is. It'll be, a fairly, I don't want to say difficult, but just a very controlled site to get this thing up and running. We did, just to briefly say the revisions that we did do. I took the worst test pit with 4 feet of groundwater, and kind of carried that all the way through. And I just wanted to see if I can get the drainage to work with a 4-foot groundwater. It changed the soils from A's to B's, which basically slows the infiltration rate design down a little bit, so it'll create a larger system. Basically, I made a design that's completely conservative, and I wanted to make it, the lack of a better term, bulletproof, if you will. And you know, I'm there. I have a system that actually works. That it takes into account for B soils, and you know, I'm sure Mr. Reardon, Mr. Chessier at some point will have some additional comments with regards to the revised design. We do have to do. We are going to be doing some additional soil testing. We are going to be doing tracing the existing drainage pipes on the site. We're in contact with a contractor for that. So we're working very hard to address all the concerns raised. And as usual, it kind of just makes for a better project. So, you know, once we're there, you guys will get a set of revised plans with a revised set of calculations, a little bit more robust operation and stormwater operation and maintenance plan and the like. So we'll be contacting Mr. Berkeley at DPW about sewer capacity and see if they have any recent hydrant flow tests up on Blue Hill Ave. And yeah, we're just going to continue to work to answer your questions and make this project viable.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. Are there any other, before I open this hearing up, if there are any other questions from the members?
Mr. Chair, could I ask a quick question of Jim?
Mr. Reardon.
Jim, one of the things that really had me a bit confused is there was, on the 3 test pits that you have at the back of the site, there was like an 8-foot elevation difference in the groundwater, estimated seasonal high groundwater. Any idea on what's causing that? I wouldn't expect to see that in A soils.
You know, if you go over on that side, there's like a foundation.
Okay.
You know, so it could be a little bit disturbed. I'm actually interested to do some test pits up close to the garden where I expect that backyard to be fill. You know, if you go down to the edge of that property, once you get on there and take a peek at it, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Okay.
You get down to the edge and you can see kind of the natural grade where Meeting House Lane kind of ends. And the homes that are built there, you know, there isn't a lot of alteration of terrain in that particular area. But then as you approach Blue Hill Ave in the back of the gardens, in the back of the house, you can see that there's some fill that was brought in there. And, you know, I think it's just been kicked around a little bit on that side. And I think the 4 feet, and just given what's been going on across the street, I'm familiar with some test pits, you know, on the other side of Blue Hill Ave. I think 4 feet is probably you know, a good estimation of what the natural grade groundwater is and in this area. And that's kind of why I chose it. And
Thanks.
yeah, that's about it.
Mr. Schomer, any questions, comments?
One comment, Mr. Chair, just in regards to Mr. Reardon's questions and feedback regarding the turn radiuses. And I think we can clear this up pretty easily. I noticed in Mr. Reardon's report that it doesn't look like the MDM transportation report that we submitted with our application was part of the materials that were provided to him. And that report does contain an auto turn analysis of the Milton's largest ladder truck as well as a 30-foot box truck. So perhaps Ms. Barrett could put me in touch with Mr. Reardon and we could provide those plans to him.
No, I had access to the report. I didn't look at that report. So I'll do that. Thank you.
It's the final 2 pages.
Okay. Appreciate
I
that.
believe it's on the board's website. Am I correct?
Yes.
It is. I just didn't go into the traffic report. That's why.
Well, you weren't asked to do the traffic review, so that's fine. There is another consultant who will be doing that.
Jesse, Mr. Schumer, I would probably still want to see another vehicle just to represent what would be a sort of a more routine vehicle that would use the roadway, just as supplemental information as well. But I'll take a look at that and see how it presents.
Sure, we can certainly provide that, and I guess I would suggest that whenever the board feels it appropriate to take this additional site walk with Mr. Reardon and Mr. Burke and Mr. Berkeley from DPW, we're happy to arrange that.
That's going to be a function of when we can see a revised design.
Yep.
There's too many unknowns right now. I mean, I think if we did it now, we would be doing yet another site visit. So I
Agreed.
think that's, I don't know, I'm not the final word on that, but that's my judgment. So if people strongly feel that that is wrong, let me know.
I would very much prefer to do the site walk after seeing the revised design.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yep.
Mr. Schomer, is that it for now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have a few comments and questions for Mr. Reardon, if I may.
Through the chair.
So just on the site circulation issue, while it's still fresh in my mind, I believe that the auto turn analysis showed that the fire truck would have to cross the center line repeatedly through that road, and I believe that that's generally a problem. I think roads should be designed so that trucks don't have to cross the center line. So I don't know, Mr. Reardon, if you have a comment on that point, maybe.
It's my understanding that the road as it circulates around the back of the building is a one-way. So I'd have to see the actual plan before commenting further on that.
The road, we'll deal with this now. The road has been designed to be one way from the entrance to the garage, clockwise to the south exit.
And my principal concerns are at the back corners of the building and how it gets around those corners, which I believe are both one-way circulation.
They would be, yes.
Locations where there's a center line that needs to cross off, take a look at that.
Yeah. Mr. Hill.
And with respect to snow removal, I did note on the site plan, it's pretty narrow on the north side of the building between the building and the property line. So if you're a plow truck coming in, say this week when we have a half foot of snow or a foot of snow, it seems to me like you're going to be plowing snow off onto the Delphi Academy property. It's a long stretch to get from the beginning of the project, from the entrance of the driveway to the back of the building. Isn't it likely that snow is going to be pushed on the side of the road? And the side of the road is, as you mentioned, only 4 or 5 feet from the Delphi Academy property, and that's actually a retaining wall. There's a drop of a couple feet then going onto the Delphi property.
I definitely think if they're allowed to, that will happen. There are a lot of solutions that can be employed. I mean, even it's not unrealistic to think of heating the roadway. So, in situations like that where it's really, really tight, sometimes it's economical just to put heat tracing in the roadway and you basically melt it as soon as it lands.
With respect to the soil tests, I'm hearing now that there's going to be additional soil testing of the property. I know that was a concern that John Chesty had raised, that there were not sufficient soil tests in the locations of the infiltration systems, and Mr. Reardon, you raised that point as well. Mr. Chairman, I would strongly recommend that the additional soil testing that's done on the site be witnessed by a certified soil evaluator. And I know it's not necessarily required for stormwater management. You require it for Title V and septic systems. But I think given the real severity of the issue with the downgradient properties, the flooding that has been documented at the last hearing under current conditions, that I think it's really critical that we get this right and make sure we know exactly what the soils are and where the groundwater is in the property.
Mr. Schomer.
Mr. Chair, I don't have a view about that. I think the soil test pits are being performed by a certified professional engineer, and that's satisfactory under the statutes, as far as I'm aware. Perhaps Jim Burke can comment further on that.
Mr. Burke.
I have, I'm a soil evaluator in Massachusetts. I have another one licensed as well in my office. We're required to report the conditions that as they exist on site, and we'll continue to do that.
To the applicant, is it an unreasonable burden to accommodate Mr. Hill's request to have a licensed soil evaluator on site? Recognizing what Mr. Burke just said.
I would have to rely on Jim to speak to that, Mr. Chair. I don't know how burdensome that is.
It's not a burden at all. I would ask if Mr. Reardon is a licensed soil evaluator.
I am not, so we can certainly make someone available. My concern is that the test pits should be done by a certified soil evaluator, and I believe the first test pits were.
Yes.
You just want to make sure, number one, that a qualified person is doing the test pits. Typically, towns will sometimes witness them, whether it's a Board of Health or a DPW person. So as long as they're witnessed by another qualified person, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be someone from our office, but it's probably a good idea to have them witnessed.
Mr. Hill? Oh, go ahead, Mr. Burke.
That'll be a first for me. I mean, I certainly had my test pits witnessed for Board of Health. Never had them witnessed for drainage, but that's fine.
Can we say that we have agreement that the test pits will be witnessed by a licensed soil evaluator as has been recommended?
We do. We're in agreement.
Mr. Hill?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to be clear, what I would recommend is somebody that's retained by the town. So whether it's someone from Mr. Reardon's office or maybe there's somebody in town hall.
Yeah.
The Board of Health uses a gentleman named Mr. Brogna.
That's fine.
So just so you know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that from a cost or a procurement perspective. I am interested in the soils, and it's been my experience that people who are registered in their fields are concerned about keeping their registration and therefore have a fair bit of veracity. Perhaps Mr. Zawinski can speak to whether there's an on-call contract or whether we need to address that with a true third party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll have to check in with the Public Health Department about that. And I'd also, we don't have to do this right now, but just look at Mr. Reardon's scope of services. If it's possible for it to be in-house on his end, that would be great. But we want to make sure we're within the contracted scope. So I'll have to do a little bit more research on that.
Mr. Burke?
If I may, I have done some perk tests in the town of Milton. I've done some septic systems as well. Corresponding to that, the costs are known. And I think that if we go through the Board of Health and use their pricing structure, I think it's affordable for my client to have it witnessed by the agent for the Milton Board of Health.
When are you planning on doing the testing, Mr. Burke?
I haven't scheduled it yet. The snow makes it kind of sloppy. But I can certainly coordinate that with my client and see. There's certainly an opportunity to do some site prep, and when I mean site prep, I mean like snow removal, kind of push it out of the way. We're going to do the testing, and so it's not impossible to get scheduled up next week.
All right, so let's recognizing that Mr. Hill has asked for an independent third party evaluate. I'm going to ask Ms. Barrett if she'll coordinate this activity with the applicant to see the most efficient way. What I don't want to do is delay the testing. The soil is too important and it's too fundamental to the design. That together with the fact that these are people licensed by the Commonwealth who are interested in retaining their license, I think provides enough incentive to accept the veracity of that professional representation. But all that being equal, if it is better and if the town is available, if the town's consultant is available and that if we can pay it through that, or if it can be paid for, I mean, I'll speak for all the members, but I don't think the board will have an objection to that. Let's just make it efficient and as responsive to what we're hearing tonight as possible. Is that the sense of where we are?
Yes, sir.
I would try to keep this kind of within Mr. Reardon's firm as much as we can, or if necessary, someone even subbing to them, just so there's one firm kind of on top of this.
No objection. No
Yeah.
objection. Ms. Barrett, you've been deputized. Mr. Hill?
Thank you.
All right, thanks. Just staying on the topic of drainage, one of the comments that Mr. Berkeley made at the last meeting was the stream, and that came up again tonight. Mr. Berkeley had indicated that the stream that's off-site on the Delphic property and then runs parallel to Meeting House Lane, that actually has a watershed area that would include, Blue Hill Avenue and Bose Hill Road. And then again, we heard a lot of testimony about how neighbors on Meeting House Lane experience flooding during storm events. So there's a real capacity issue, I think, on that stream. And I guess the question is there any additional testing or analysis, Mr. Reardon, that you'd recommend at this stage to determine whether the site has adequate capacity for drainage? And related to that, Mr. Berkeley had mentioned that he brought the point that this site will be recharging a lot more water under future conditions than it would under existing conditions with all the new impervious areas, and that recharge could potentially increase the flow of water in that stream and potentially exacerbate the current flooding problems. So is there something that we should be doing at this stage to maybe better characterize or understand the impacts of all this recharge on the stream and then on the down gradient properties?
I think to that point, the more we can understand about how that stream functions and whether it's more a drainage channel serving upstream stormwater runoff or something that's fed by groundwater. From the descriptions I've heard, it seems like it's predominantly fed by upstream stormwater runoff. The way the sort of events are described and the flow is described, it sounds more like something that's a stormwater runoff item than a traditional groundwater fed stream. But those are things that all should be looked at, and the more information that we can compile as to how that stream functions and what it serves, the better off we'll be. The fortunate thing is, under the stormwater standards, the project is not allowed to increase its peak rate of runoff from the site. So there's a certain amount of sort of guaranteed mitigation that's built into those stormwater standards that prevents any really whole-scale shifts in how that stream will function. But to your point, there are subtle differences between introducing groundwater versus introducing runoff. So, we got to be cognizant of the fact that, that groundwater that we introduce at our site could end up as flow in that stream if the soils don't support what's being proposed. We'll keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and I think to that point, Mr. Chairman, since there's going to be some additional test pits out there in the next few weeks, it may make sense, subject to Mr. Reardon's agreement, to have maybe a test pit or two done next to the stream, if the applicant can get permission from the property owners. The advantage to that is that then you can establish how close the water table is to the stream bed, and if the water table is at or very near the elevation of the stream bed, there's a strong likelihood that stream is groundwater fed. And then again, we have this concern. Of course, that could also eliminate this question. I mean, if it's determined by looking at the stream that there is no groundwater entering the stream, that it's basically a drainage channel that maybe the bottom is impervious for all we know, then that would eliminate this concern. So that may be something that the applicant may want to look at, or we may want the applicant to look at over the next few weeks.
Mr. Reardon, what's your thought on that?
Well, and I agree with Mr. Hill. The one thing I would qualify that with is it's more likely that groundwater from the site trends down the hill towards Meeting House Lane than it would to move laterally towards the stream. So I would expect groundwater to generally follow the path of the stream and not sort of go direct to it. But I think it would be prudent to get as much data as we can to test those assumptions and to prove those assumptions.
Okay. Shifting a little bit to the sewer pipe, we heard a lot of testimony last week about the capacity of the sewer pipe, and I guess maybe it's a question for the chair as well as Mr. Reardon, but would it be prudent to require the applicant to demonstrate that that the sewer pipe that it's relying on to carry sewage away from this property has adequate capacity, and that specifically the sewer line that's in Meeting House Lane is adequate. I mean, we've done this before where we've actually sent cameras into these pipes to look for inflow, infiltration. Do we have any leakages? Is there any blockages? Is the pipe size big enough? I mean, aren't those the kind of things that the applicant should be proving at this stage, so that we know we actually have a viable project that can actually discharge the waste away?
Mr. Reardon, thoughts on that?
We've asked for that information. So let's deal with one piece at a time. I'm of the opinion that this clay sewer that currently traverses the site should be replaced. I think the initial plans showed they were connecting to that clay sewer with their building service. I don't think that's prudent. I think that the entire service that extends through the site should be replaced, just to make sure that we take the opportunity now to upgrade that. Clay pipes are old. They have a lot of joints, historically don't do a great job of surviving, construction projects. So, and I think that's probably going to end up being the net result when they start designing the revised stormwater system. The pipe in Meeting House Lane, I wouldn't expect that to be a capacity issue only because of how steep Meeting House Lane is. What I would say is my focus would be on the area that collects from Meeting House Lane. So down at the bottom, I'd be more interested in seeing how the sewer that serves Meeting House Lane at the bottom of the hill functions, because I think it's going to be a pretty easy exercise to demonstrate that there's capacity in the line going down Meeting House Lane because it's so steep. But based on what you guys said tonight about where that problem of flooding was at the bottom of the hill, that raises my hackles about whether or not that sewer that's at the bottom of the hill is adequate supply. And what we need there is, again, real data. So even if it's just an observation on a couple different days during the spring as to what's seen at certain times of the day, we can very easily correlate that to actual capacity.
Well, the person that had the problem is the house that's at the corner of Meeting House and
Alfred.
Alfred. So he's in I think he's in the line that's in Meeting House, and he was having an issue in the past with sewage backing up into his basement, basically. So that sounded to me like a capacity issue in the line that's in Meeting House, and who knows what it is. If it was just, you're right, it's steep, but even if it's steep, there could be blockages. It could be.
Well, what we should do is we should do a little bit of forensics on that particular case. I mean, that's invaluable information and it needs to be explored. If there was a situation where raw sewage came up into someone's home, that needs to be addressed completely. And we need to find out what that problem was, whether it was root penetration into their lateral or whether it was a problem in the street. We definitely need to resolve that issue.
And would you agree that the burden is on the applicant to demonstrate that the project will have adequate sewer capacity, period? I mean, and that means
yes, from
the building itself to the main that's in Alfred Street.
Yes. And even beyond, if there are known problems downstream and we're adding to the flow, there needs to be a reconciliation of how the project certainly doesn't make anything worse. The one thing we do have is, I understand that there's an II obligation, so that's inflow and infiltration, that with the new flow, the project will have an obligation to either contribute or remove II from the system. So generally that usually creates a net benefit, but we've got to make sure that that's focused on solving problems that might be created by the project.
Okay. And then the last topic, Mr. Chair, if I may, is the garage. I noticed, Mr. Reardon, that you had some comments, you had some concerns, I think, with the access into the garage for emergency vehicles. And I guess, we actually had raised some questions about the garage, the accessibility to the garage, specifically how solid waste is going to be taken out. It doesn't seem to be a lot of thought about how garbage trucks are going to come in and out of the site and pick up the trash. There's no trash room even shown in the floor plans. And one of the big issues that we had raised was that there's, the garage is basically full of parking right now, and it provides the parking that they've shown. The number of spaces is in the garage, and there's some surface spaces, but there seems to be other programming space that's needed in the garage, such as mechanical rooms, such as a trash room, and just general swing space that simply isn't shown in the floor plan. This may be a little bit outside of your scope, but I'm just wondering if you had looked at that issue and had any comments on it.
I hadn't looked at those specific issues you mentioned, but I did look at the layout of the parking, and actually it came up in a conversation with Jim and I this morning about how I'd like to see some dimensions on that parking, and I'd feel a little bit more comfortable if the parking was laid out by a civil engineer as opposed to an architect, not to sort of besmirch the architects, but parking is kind of our thing, and I'd feel a little bit more comfortable if I had an engineer's eyes on the layout to make sure that the things that we're concerned about getting vehicles in and out of spaces are accommodated. But to your point, yeah, I mean, they're going to have to find a way to get traffic in and out of there, and certainly it's a very narrow approach at a 90-degree angle coming off a relatively narrow roadway. So yeah, I mean, our concerns also extend to the fact that it's a large collection of underground vehicles under residential use. We'd really like to see the fire department's input on how they would respond to something happening in that lower level. With this advent of electric cars now, they have a whole new sort of issue related to fires. So we definitely want to make sure that we're thoughtful and deferential to the needs of the people that are going to respond to things in the parking garage.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I didn't have any other substantive comments. On my list of action items, I think for the applicant was they're doing some test pits. They're going to look at the stream. They're going to look at the drain pipe. They need to look at the sewer and provide an analysis on sewer capacity. Mr. Schomer had mentioned he was going to provide copies of the easements or the easement, which I haven't seen yet. Maybe he's provided that, but I don't think it's posted on the website yet. And that's all I had for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. I wonder if, we can always review the tape on the testimony that was offered by the gentleman whose name I'm not remembering, I apologize, who was on Meeting House near Alfred, who testified to the effect that they had a family home that had the sewerage issue. I wonder if it would be possible to either review the tape so that Mr. Reardon could have the benefit of that testimony, or if the person who offered that to us last time could either send us an email, or Mr. O'Brien may have some information, or otherwise make himself available. Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to my notes, it was a Mr. Gallagher, I believe.
Mr. Gallagher, correct.
And Mr. Chairman, when you're finished, I have a question regarding that, given what Mr. Reardon and something that Attorney Hill.
Well, go ahead, Mr. O'Brien.
So let me pull it up here for a second. While we're on the issue of stormwater, paragraph 20, item number 27 on your letter noted that there was last paragraph, the stormwater management section stipulates the project complies with stormwater management standards to the extent practicable. And that it was the wrong standard that was being mentioned because the project is not considered a redevelopment project since it results in impervious surface area, and as such must demonstrate strict compliance with the standards. I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit for somebody like me that doesn't understand what you just said.
Sure. So the maximum extent practicable means that it applies a certain level of latitude. So the only time that you're allowed to have that latitude is under the stormwater standards is when you have a project that's considered a redevelopment project. So if you're redeveloping a site, you have a certain amount of latitude under the stormwater guidance documents to sort of do the best you can. But that standard only applies to redevelopment projects. This project, although intuitively it's a redevelopment project, does not meet the standard of a redevelopment project under the guidelines. So that's an inaccurate statement. They have to meet the standards or they don't comply with the regulations. It might not have been as clear as I had hoped, but.
It was clear enough, I think,
All right.
within the confines of what I've been learning this evening and beforehand. I thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I have a question for Mr. Sawinski.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you. Mr. Sawinski, I know that you were on, I believe you were on the line when the sewage issue was mentioned by that homeowner on Meeting House Lane. I don't believe that the DPW director was on. Has there been some discussion or a meeting at the DPW regarding this particular issue?
So that was my first call. As soon as I got to the office the following morning, was to make sure that Mr. Berkeley had a chance to, I don't know if the tape was up at that point, but just to make sure that he was going to review that tape and kind of get a feel for that issue. So I can follow up on that and see if there's been any further action on that, but he's aware that there's an issue and he's going to take a look at the tape and we can go from there.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think it may be of interest to the board to ascertain if there have been similar incidents of that nature in that area reported to the town.
Correct. I agree. I think that's all going to come out in the sewer capacity analysis, and is part of the request for the walk down of this whole stretch of hydrology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome, Mr. O'Brien. Let me ask, there being no further questions of the participants in the hearing, if there's anybody in the audience who would like to be recognized with a question as to the testimony we've heard tonight.
The Donahues.
Mr. Donahue, Ms. Donahue, I know they always P. Donahue, so I don't know if it's Ms. or Mrs. or Mr.
You.
Bev, are you recognizing them or?
I certainly am, and I've asked them to unmute. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ms. Donahue or Mr. Donahue, please unmute.
Well, if they want to be put on hold, we have Amy and Michael McGrath.
McGrath, welcome.
Hi, it's Amy McGrath. I just have a few questions that I would just like some clarification on. Mr. Reardon, and I don't know if this is just sort of a terminology, but when you were talking about what is the difference between, you say, an urban versus a suburban site, does that have any, that's just sort of how you would describe the site, or does that have bearing on what your review of the project is?
No, it doesn't. I think it was in reference to the sewer infrastructure. So what we would expect on an urban site is that the sewer infrastructure surrounding it is more robust in more able to handle fluctuations, as opposed to a suburban system, which we typically narrowly defined and smaller.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I'm struggling with the fact that I just don't understand. We did the presentation, and obviously the board spent their time reviewing, and we had the peer review of a drainage system, of the stormwater drainage system that we were told worked by the applicant. So I don't understand how that happens. And then, obviously there's a science to it, there's an engineering to it. that we now have a completely different site. Is it because, I know Mr. Ridden, you talked about, the difference between a redevelopment site and what we have here. Is that why it's totally different? I'm just struggling to understand that.
I can tell you it's not unique. I mean, we have situations like that where systems get started in one location and move drastically. I can only defer to Jim on why he selected the location he did.
That's all he has left.
That's something you want me to address, sir?
I don't, I mean, okay, yeah, Mr.
If the board is satisfied, then
I'm not.
you don't need to take time.
No, we're not satisfied, but I mean, I think it's a little bit of history. I think the board is, well, speak for myself. It's a little frustrating that it didn't work. But it didn't work, and we're taking steps to correct it. I think it could have been done a little bit more efficiently, but as Mr. Schomer has reminded us several times, this is an iterative process, and we're working in real time. So I don't know. I just don't know what can be gained from answering the question. Although I will ask if Mr. Burke does want to address Ms. McGrath's question, I'd be pleased to hear the answer.
I think, Mr. Chairman, that you explained it very succinctly, in the fact that it's an iterative process, and given my experience in the town of Milton with regards to the soils in the area, I felt that the revisions were warranted. Simple as that.
Yeah, we're looking. I mean, suffice to say, we're anxious to see and everybody's anxious, particularly the McGraths, because as we know from prior testimony, they've got some particular issue and some particular experience with water on their property. So I don't want to speak for Ms. McGrath, but I think it is fair to say that the board has been sensitized to those issues. So we're anxious to see what the redesign is and to have the professionals look at it. Ms. McGrath, additional questions?
I just have one more that's really directed at Ms. Barrett, and I'm not expecting you to answer this, but what I've been struggling with through the process is, at what point does, financial feasibility sort of tip over a line? Because, if someone goes and writes a check for $3 million and buys a site, that's a site that is, basically, you need platinum level stormwater, if it even works, the traffic concerns, whatever needs to be done on the site is so expensive that it's not financially feasible for, a competent real estate developer to do it. At what point does that come to, okay, you can't just shove 118 units on a site that does not support in any way, shape, or form 118 units, just because someone made a decision during their due diligence period to buy a property that doesn't work?
So the town special counsel, Johanna Schneider, and I actually reviewed this with the select board last week. And I can tell you what we had said during that meeting. The regulations are pretty clear. The regulations that have been in effect since 2008 lay out a process for a board of appeals to essentially challenge the applicant's assumptions about financial feasibility. And what needs to happen is that the board is going to go through this process of reviewing the application and its associated impacts and the various iterations that the applicant comes forward with, because as we've all been told umpteen times, it's an iterative process. So when we finally get to one that the applicant says is their plan, the board really has to decide whether that's acceptable or not. And if the board wants to request some changes to the plan, which the applicant says they can't do because it will make their project uneconomic, at that point, the board can request a peer review of the financials for the project. And the applicant has to submit essentially two pro formas, one showing kind of what their proposal is, and the other what the board's requested changes would do to the financial feasibility of the project. when that is submitted, the board can request an independent consultant to review that. And we are currently lining up a peer review consultant to have on hand to do those reviews in case that becomes necessary. But it's premature right now, despite everything that you've said, it's premature for the board to go there because they're still in the middle of reviewing the project.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett.
Thank you very
Anything further,
much.
Ms.
No,
McGrath?
thank you.
Anybody else wish to be recognized?
We could try and call the Donahues again.
The Donahues, Ms. Donahue. Anybody else like to be recognized?
We have no one else,
Okay. Is there anything
except for
further?
Frank.
I'm sorry,
I think Frank just had his hand up.
Mr. O'Brien.
No.
Nothing further, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schumer, anything further this evening?
Nothing further from me, Mr. Chair, unless you'd like to address that issue of the
do.
the landscape architecture.
I do. Let me ask Mr. Hill, is there anything further on this topic?
Not on civil engineering. I did have a follow-up question on traffic issues.
Traffic is next week.
Okay.
Go ahead, ask your
Well, no,
question.
we had actually made a recommendation that the applicant, David Black, had made a recommendation that the applicant do a field survey of the site distances looking south. I don't know if that's actually underway or if the board actually wanted the applicant to do that. That's an outstanding issue that came out of David Black's presentation.
Mr. Burke.
I had my field crew go out there and shoot the gutter lines of Blue Hill Ave in both directions. And the data is in my office and ready for compilation.
And Mr. Hill, I think it is fair to say the board is interested in that sight line from the south, looking south, the crest of the hill. I believe Mr. Tran has testified to that on a couple of occasions now. Let me ask, Mr. Reardon, thank you for your professional presentation and your expertise and the time you spent with us tonight. I very much appreciate it on behalf of the board. And we look forward to working with you on this project.
Same here. Could I ask a quick question? Do we know
Reardon.
the address of Mr. Gallagher's home? The one with the sewer problem?
That's part of the tasks that we've delegated to Ms. Barrett, and she'll be in touch.
I will.
I don't know the address. It's either at or near Meeting House in Alfred. On the let me just touch on the garden on the peer review. So we got your letter. I don't know that the board, without prejudging the outcome, has anything that we can do about what you've said. But I just want to state that, to me, this hearing is all about balancing the regional need for housing with the local concerns. I think that's perhaps a crude, but nevertheless accurate summary of what the statute's all about. We have heard many times that one of the local concerns, if not a primary local concern, in addition to the hearing we've had tonight and the technical engineering things, are the gardens. And to have received your letter and to have rejected our attempt to have a professional look at the attempt to save the gardens is a bit frustrating, particularly after hearing that the applicant is taking into consideration all of the testimony that we've heard, and the Mass Housing has told you in your letter, in its letter, that you should expect the town of Milton, having expressed both from the town officials and from the neighbors concern about preservation of both the mansion and the gardens. So I don't quite understand how it is that we can't get traction on this issue and have somebody look at this independently, given the significance of this particular cultural resource. So that's a bit of a rant, perhaps, and perhaps a monologue, but that was my feeling having read your letter. I'm not prepared to give up on the issue, and I appreciate your willingness, the applicant's willingness, not you, Mr. Schomer particularly, but the applicant's willingness to get back at it at the appropriate time. But it's a fair statement from my impression of this hearing is that there's been an enormous amount of concern expressed about those gardens, and I want to impart that upon the applicant. Let me ask the members if they've got anything they'd like to add.
I have a few comments. I'd like to
Offer.
thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd actually like to start with a question that I guess is directed to Mr. Chair or perhaps Ms. Barrett. Does the town have a budget for things classified as independent studies?
I don't know.
I'm not aware of that, but if I could just maybe address, I think, where you might be going with this. The regulations are remarkably clear. It's the board that decides what reviews the board needs in order to review an application. The applicant doesn't get to make that decision. The applicant submits a plan, and the board looks at the plan and says, what assistance do we need to review this? By the applicant's logic, someone could submit a site plan that encroaches on a wetland. And because there's an encroachment on a wetland, the peer review consultant can't look at that and comment on whether there are alternatives or other ways to address the site design. So just because the applicant hasn't proposed them. So, you guys get to decide what assistance you need. And I have to tell you, I've been doing this work since probably Attorney Schomer was in high school. And I don't think I've ever seen such an insulting response to a board requesting peer review support. It's not a great way to start a hearing like this for a $4,200 review.
Thanks, Ms. Barrett. Ms. Jaffer.
Yes, thank
I
you.
think the answer is no.
Pardon me? The answer is no.
I think so.
Right. I was just curious because I guess echoing Mr. Chair's and perhaps Ms. Barrett's frustrations that the tone of the letter is, you'll get the information maybe later, maybe not, depending how we frame things. And so I wondered if I could circumvent all of that and tap a town fund. But since I can't, I'll give my opinion on the actual letter. One, I think as a question of the law, as stated in the letter, which I have now read, that to me it's clear that this peer review is permissible. So the letter states that the standard is we are not allowed to impose costs that are unreasonable or unnecessary. I don't think this is unreasonable. As Ms. Barrett noted, it's just over $4,000 in contrast to what is obviously a multi-million-dollar proposed project. It's also not unnecessary for the reasons that Mr. Chair stated, right? We are here to assess whether the project is consistent with local needs. And some of the loudest, most passionate voices from our community have been about the preservation of the historical garden. And then it also says in your letter that the cost should be in connection with the application. And in connection is a sort of a broad term that I think any lawyers on the board or participating in the hearing or listening from the community would say is very broadly interpreted always, right? In connection. It's so broad. And what popped to mind to me is the comparison of if we were saying a playground would be nice on this project, let's have someone opine on a playground. That might not be in connection with this application. But if you are proposing, as you put it, Mr. Schomer, to put a building on the garden, then our review of the historic preservation possibilities of that garden seemed to me to be clearly in connection with the application. So as a legal matter, I think that we are sort of well within our bounds, Mr. Chair, to make the decision to insist that this continue and that this continue now, because it's a priority. And then really maybe as just extra commentary and observation that I have made is that the applicant's position is that regardless of the local outcry, maybe it's a little dramatic to call it an outcry, I'll call it an outcry anyway, about the historical garden, that they will just not address it. So it started with the application itself, which gave very shorthand to any historic value of the home or the gardens, simply by noting that it was not on any register, which I understand was accurate at the time, but may not be accurate now. Then one of the first questions I asked at the first hearing was related to efforts to potentially save the historical gardens, and the answer is no, there were no efforts. There was then a question on the site visit as to whether the condition of the existing home, and there was a refusal on the part of the applicant to answer that question. And now this letter, and I just think the strategy of the applicant is clear, that they are not interested in discussing this at all. And my view is that they are well within their rights to take that position. But as a board, we must have that discussion because the community is demanding it. And it's squarely within our mandate, which is to assess local needs. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Enough. Well said. Thank you, Ms. Jaffa. Mr. O'Brien.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I could say it any better than Ms. Jaffer has said, so I associate my comments with hers. Thank you.
Kilmer.
May I just respond, Mr. Chair?
Yes, you've been recognized.
Oh, thank you. Just to be clear, sometimes great minds think alike and sometimes they don't. And I hope that it's understood by the board members and by Ms. Barrett that there was no intent to be insulting in any way with our letter. We happen to disagree on this specific point in terms of how we view the appropriate scope of peer review. And I think that that's okay. People can disagree and still be respectful of each other. And that was certainly our intent with the letter. Our view is different from the board's. And I would completely agree with Ms. Barrett that it is within the board's authority to direct this peer review to be done. The regulations provide that this is intended to be a collaborative process. We made our objections and we appreciate the opportunity to do so, but it is within the board's power to vote to override those. And if the board votes to do so, I'll see to it that my client deposits these funds as soon as possible.
What do you say to Ms. Schumer? What do you say to the board's suggestion that the applicant simply doesn't intend to address an alternatives analysis to the preservation of both the mansion and the gardens, despite the clear expression of local concern and the indication from Mass Housing that this was going to come up at this hearing?
What I would say in response to that, Mr. Chair, is that we are very much actively considering our options to preserve either or both of the gardens or the house. And that is an honest assessment of what we are doing. You have my assurances that we are legitimately looking into these as options as a team. And we understand and have heard loud and clear, I think, from both the board members of the public, from the Historical Commission, from Attorney Hill and his clients, that this is a big concern from the locals. And we have heard that, and you have my assurance that we are looking into it to address those concerns.
Would it not then be advantageous to that review to have a peer review professional look at the potential of saving these gardens as you consider your redesign?
As I said in my letter, Mr. Chair, I think that there is an appropriate time for that. And I think that the appropriate time for that is if there is a proposal to do that. And I frankly, I think if we come back with a proposal to do that, I think that would be welcomed on our part, because I think that that would be valuable feedback for us. With that having been said, as I said a moment ago, this is within the board's power to order. And as I said, if the determination of the board is that these funds will be allocated by the applicant to this peer review as outlined in the scope, we will comply.
I understand that. I'm trying to avoid a situation like we're in now, where we paid Mr. Reardon's to evaluate a design that's now been completely scrapped, and we now have to pay him. And I don't. It's not the money; it's the time to evaluate a brand new design. And I'm wondering if that's where we're headed with the gardens. On the other hand, I value this resource, and I'm mindful enough of the concern that's been expressed that I do think the community is demanding a third-party evaluation of the ability to save these gardens. And I do think that there's been adequate testimony both from town officials during the application process and from the community during the application process and from both during this hearing process that this is a serious local concern. And I'm puzzled as to why the applicant does not share that view. It just seems elementary to me, as concerning as the stormwater, or perhaps I don't want to rank them, but they're certainly both local concerns.
What I would say in response to that, Mr. Chair, is we're aware of the concern, and certainly this issue is understood by us to be a matter of interest to the neighbors and the board members. It isn't that we don't acknowledge the concern or accept it as a valid concern. They are valid concerns. In my view, the production of affordable housing outweighs it, and I think that's pretty clear in this case. However, if the board feels that this is appropriate at this time, it's within your authority to go down that road.
Yeah, you just stated a conclusion, though, which concerns me. The conclusion you just stated is that the regional need outweighs the local concern without an evaluation of an alternative, which you've also professed to do. So which is it? Are we evaluating alternatives, or are we reaching conclusions prior to the evaluation?
That was merely my opinion, Mr. Chair.
You're the counsel to the applicant. This, I mean,
if I may, Mr. Chair, I think the circumstances as they're already understood based on testimony in the record, based on the extent of his historical protection in the town of Milton, in my view, as a matter of law, the historical concerns here, particularly in view of the fact that this property itself is not open to the public, it's not a landmarked property before the summer of 2020. As a matter of law, in my opinion, it does not rise to the level of outweighing the need for affordable housing. And as I said before at the beginning, minds may differ, and the board may disagree with me on that assessment.
I don't think the board's reached a conclusion. The board's seeking for additional facts and testimony and expertise on a matter where we've experienced and received a very large amount of local interest. And I think we owe that to the community. But let me hear from the members of the board as to what their pleasure is with respect to this matter. Mr. O'Brien.
Chairman, if I may, I would like to ask Mr. Schomer a question.
Please.
Thank you. Mr. Schomer, are you suggesting that the board's interest in the historical nature of the building and the gardens is in some way, shape, or form pretextual, and that somehow the board is prejudging the application in this matter? Because if you are, I would be very concerned about that.
Not at all, Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
What's the board's pleasure?
Mr. Chair, I have a question in response to Mr. Schomer's comments. He said that the applicant is actively considering preservation options for both the home and the garden. And my question is whether the applicant can commit to reporting to the board on those deliberations at a set time.
Mr. Schumer.
What I would propose in that regard, Ms. Joffer, is to respond as part of our response to the entirety of the peer review. And so my understanding is next week will be the design component of the peer review as well as the traffic. And perhaps if the board is, as it sounds, is inclined to instruct us to fund the account for the landscape architecture peer review, that may be somewhat lagging. But I think we can get back to the board relatively quickly with the response following next week. And I think we'll be able to answer maybe more definitively after next week's hearing.
I'd like to lay the question on the table, Mr. Schomer, and I'd like to ask you for a specific response to Ms. Joffer's question in connection with the earlier question we asked as to how to continue the hearing after the completion of the site, if the peer review is next Tuesday. So my thought on next Tuesday is following the completion of the peer review, we'd like to hear from the applicant on the period of time it will take the applicant to respond to the peer reviews and to conduct the redesigns for the purposes of recalibrating this hearing with the technology that is available to us. And, if people look at the schedule, you recognize that I've got the 17th, 18th, 23rd, and the 2nd of March set aside, but those are all to be determined pending a reasonable subject matter. And it could be that we find ourselves suspending this hearing pending the additional input from your team. That's the way it's starting to feel to me. Is that fair?
I would say in response to that, Mr. Chair, I think by the 2nd we'll be able to, March the 2nd, we'll be able to come back with definitive responses to most or all of the concerns that the board has raised in the community as well.
Okay. All right. Let me ask if the board wishes to vote on the matter of asking for the peer review tonight, is so that review can be completed on a schedule where we can get some reasonable input into the design. For the record, my concern is my experience with things like this is issues that are raised late in the process are not, you just don't have enough time to incorporate the best ideas into the project. That's been my experience. Others may have different experiences. And while we run some risk of being inefficient in the review because we may be seeing a redesign, we may not. And I, for one, would like to be better informed on the reasonable possibilities of steps that could be taken to save these gardens. But I'll be guided. Let me ask Ms. Barrett if she's got something she'd like to address the board on at this moment.
Other than, I think the board should vote to require the applicant to pay for the peer review. And if you choose to, have Martha Lyon hold on that, that's up to the board. But I think you want to make sure that you have access to that resource, especially given the amount of attention that's been given to this. So it is your decision what reviews you need. I made that request of the landscape architect because the board had indicated that it needed that assistance. So unless you've changed your mind, I assume you need that assistance.
Fair enough. And let me put it in the form of a motion. I make a motion that we request that the peer review be done and that the applicant fund the work to be done, and further that there be an attention be given to the reasonable alternatives to address saving the gardens, recognizing that we have had testimony on the significance of the architect and on the product itself. So I'm not sure Well, I recognize that the professionals' work from Northampton's work will touch on both, but I'll make that in the form of a motion. Ms. Joffer,
Do you need a second?
we didn't take a rule on whether seconds were needed. I think Mr. Leonard usually likes to have a second.
Okay. For the aforementioned reasons, I second the motion.
Mr. O'Brien,
I have nothing to add, Mr. Chairman.
we're going to vote on the motion.
Aye,
All in favor?
aye.
Okay. The Board of Appeals is going to direct the completion of the peer review as outlined in the proposal that's come before it, and is going to direct the applicant to fund the peer review for the reasons stated in this hearing. We appreciate people's views, but I think the overwhelming local concern merits further evaluation of this particular resource. And we look forward to hearing from the applicant on the let me say it this way. We look forward to hearing from the applicant on the further scheduling of the conclusion of this hearing at the next scheduled meeting of the board, at the next scheduled session for this hearing, which is Tuesday, February 16th at 7 o'clock. Let me ask if there's any other business in front of the Board of Appeals for this hearing tonight. Okay, there being none, I'm going to call a recess of this hearing until Tuesday, February 16th at 7 o'clock, at which time we'll hear a peer review of the traffic and safety and on the site design, both traffic and safety and site design, and we'll hear from the applicant on the further scheduling of the hearing. Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you.
You're welcome.